My thoughts about changing the fundamental basis of the Gender Recognition Act, which was initially, if you look back at Hansard, was thought to be a way of granting privacy to transsexual people who had, it was assumed, would have had extensive medical intervention so that they would look very much like the opposite sex, and therefore it would be a reasonable worry about their privacy should they be their sex be revealed. And it was also about allowing same-sex marriage in certain contexts prior to later legislation. My worry, and also I think it was also assumed that this legal fiction that you could change sex, which was introduced through that legislation, was therapeutic for people that had gender dysphoria and for whom it would be distressing to hear, to be confronted with the facts about their sex. Now, if we're moving to self-ID, it seems to me that we've fundamentally taken away all of that rationale, because there's no longer any real worries about privacy if somebody hasn't had medical intervention. Sex is pretty obvious. And if gender dysphoria is no longer a requirement on getting this certificate, then there's no therapeutic aspect. So I just think that is one worry I have. Another set of worries I have are about the practical interactions of the Equality Act, but I think fundamentally it would have lost its rationale.
I think the key concerns that women raised around self-ID were the fact that the policy being proposed did not uphold the single-sex exemptions in the Equality Act. There was no proposal as to how the two would work together, and this would then allow people to self-ID and access women's spaces. Now, as Professor Sharp talked about, there are times when you can't have single-sex spaces, but there are times when it is proportionate and legitimate to do so, particularly around women's refuges, around prisons, especially around male violence against women. And we do know from the stats that there is no difference in terms of offending rates between trans women and men. That male violence against women remains the same across both populations. So that was a key concern, but the second concern for me was the lack of legal definitions. In other countries where there are self-ID regimes, there are usually very strong sets of laws and definitions that explain how self-ID, how gender identity, how transgenderism, whatever terms you want to use, operate alongside sex. So in Ireland, there is this self-declaration scheme. At the same time, institutions, whether they're schools or prisons or any other institutions, are able to decide whether they will remain sex segregated or whether they will be gender identity segregated. What we had in the proposals over here was very much, let's allow self-ID, but not think through how this would operate in practice.
I mean, obviously fully respect the right of trans people to live their lives and express themselves as they wish. So what really worried me was the sweeping nature of the proposed reform and what seemed to be a sort of absolutist demand really for self-ID across the board without any gatekeeping, across a whole range of domains where it seems to me that sex does matter. So one of the first things that worried me was women's sports categories, for example, and changing rooms. I was also very much struck by, in the context of proposed, what seemed to me quite sweeping legislative change, the difficulty of having any conversation about it. So one of the first things I heard about was the attack on Maria McLachlan, a 60-year-old activist who was just trying to attend a meeting on this proposed legislative reform, and she was assaulted by a young trans activist. That was the impetus for A Woman's Place UK being formed. And of course, since then, all of the meetings that Woman's Place have tried to hold to discuss this legislative change and related issues have been attacked by people trying to shut those meetings down. So that seemed to me fundamentally really strange and not something I've ever been aware of in any other proposed legislative reform.
I think that outside of academia, where we do have protection in terms of academic freedom and speech, women have had their jobs threatened, women have been physically attacked, they have been physically threatened, there have been violent threats on the internet, but also in person. And I think women are scared to speak out because women have been raised throughout history with male violence against women. And when that violence is being perpetrated, towards women who speak out, and often being perpetrated not by trans individuals, but by their allies, who often are straight heterosexual men who contain the most privilege in our societies. I think that there are those concerns. I think also the women I know, the women I've spoken to across the last 3 years, have a great deal of compassion for the suffering and distress that comes with gender dysphoria and for the intrusions into privacy that trans individuals have to go through in order to acquire a GRC. Women will voice their concerns around the sex-based right, but will also be compassionate towards trans individuals and recognise their legitimate needs and their political interests, whereas trans individuals, or particularly their allies, refuse to recognise the legitimate needs and political interests of women as a class. And that has really silenced women, because whenever women speak out, we are told we are transphobic, rather than there being any recognition that we have our own needs and concerns.
I would also like to add to what Rosa has said there, which I agree with, that what hasn't helped, I think, is HR policies in many organisations which state that, they have a very expansive definition of transphobia, which they would class as a kind of bullying and harassment, and they usually adopt, because they are Stonewall Diversity Champions, which is a branding scheme that Stonewall runs for companies, they usually adopt Stonewall's definition of transphobia, which includes the words something like fear or dislike of trans people, including denying their gender identity or refusing to accept it. Now, that's can be read in different ways, but one natural way to read that is if you think that sex is more important than gender identity across a range of domains and you want to say so, you run the risk of looking transphobic. And that isn't helped by media organisations like the BBC and The Guardian, who are also Stonewall Diversity Champions as it happens, inevitably posing views like Rosa, Alice's and mine as either transphobic, or now they have moved back a step to anti-trans. And that is just completely not true, and sets up this opposition that the only possible reason that people like us could be saying what we're saying is that we must have some problem with trans people or think that they are particularly predatory. And it's not that at all. Most women I know are concerned about male patterns of violence and male patterns of sexism, and they want to be able to retain the vocabulary to describe those patterns where they see them. But that doesn't mean we're anti-trans.
I think what's really unique about this is that you've got organisations who promote the gender identity point of view, like Stonewall, who actually explicitly have a slogan and hashtag no debate. So they're actually calling explicitly for no debate and to shut the conversation down. And that's been absolutely vicious, and I've got personal experience of this. I know that both Rosa and Kathleen have personal experience of it too, but if you don't mind me telling you my experience, I was deplatformed from a research methods seminar, believe it or not. And the reason for that was that as a quantitative social scientist, I believe that we should collect data on sex, that it's an important demographic variable. And I organised a letter to the census authorities raising some concerns about their proposed guidance, allowing people to answer the sex question according to identity instead of their sex. And as a direct result of that, a seminar on data collection on sex and gender, which I had been due to speak at the National Centre for Social Research, was cancelled rather than having me to speak. And I was told that my views would have literally made audience members unsafe. Now, that was a seminar where some of the speakers would have been from the Office for National Statistics, and some of them would have been from NatCen, and one of those was Nancy Kelly, who was at NatCen at that time and is now, of course, CEO of Stonewall. So my view that sex is a fundamental demographic variable and we should collect data on it is so mainstream within social science. It's really hard to believe how it could literally make people feel unsafe. So it was really deeply shocking to be vilified in that way and to be denied the opportunity to engage in a normal, respectful discussion. But of course, other people have been through far worse on this. There are so many examples. I won't try to cover it all. I'm very happy to send more information in writing. But one case, for example, is the historian Selina Todd at Oxford, who has to be accompanied to her lectures by security guards because the university has received credible threats. Now, she said nothing offensive unless you think that discussing women's rights is offensive. Even more disturbing, perhaps, are the attempts to shut down research and to stop research from being published For example, Lisa Lippman's research on the surge in girls presenting with gender dysphoria in the current generation. Michelle Moore is another example, a disability scholar who's raised questions about the prevalence of gender transitioning among autistic girls and has faced a campaign of harassment. But the results of this go way beyond academia. Obviously, this is painful for the academics involved, but there are serious human consequences to the wider chilling effect. You will, I'm sure, be aware of the case of Kira Bell, a young woman who has just brought a successful case against the Tavistock because she regrets the medical treatment that she received and feels she was poorly advised. And the judges in that case highlighted the lack of data and evidence on youth transition, and the fact that the Tavistock failed to collect some really obvious data, including the number of autistic girls that they were seeing. This goes way beyond academia, and I just want to name a few examples of people who've been targeted by gender activists. Maya Forstater, Alison Bailey, Sonia Appleby, and Raquel Rosario Sanchez are all women of colour who've been targeted, and I hope the committee might have the opportunity to hear some of those diverse voices in future sessions.
It's been argued that reforms to the GRA would have no impact on women's spaces because Section 7 of the Equality Act means trans women are legally able to access women-only spaces already.
What we don't have at the moment is any clarity on that, whether it's from judges or from policymakers. They've shied away from discussing, first of all, most importantly, within the Equality Act, when these sex-based exemptions are proportionate and legitimate. And there's been an awful lot of policy capture whereby organisations have spoken to NHS trusts or to schools or to other organisations, including refuges, and said to them that they do not have a proportionate and legitimate aim, even though they would do under the current law. So I think there needs to be much clearer guidance on the Equality Act itself. There needs to be much stronger definitions within the Equality Act of gender reassignment, which is different, remember, in terms of the definitions in that piece of legislation to the definitions in terms of a gender recognition certificate. I think that it comes to a crucial point that there is a need to look at the GRA. It is a piece of legislation from 16 years ago that was there to uphold our European Convention on Human Rights obligations. One of the reasons so many European countries had enacted legislation before us is that it took us many years to create the Human Rights Act and to actually incorporate those laws into our domestic laws and to be bound by the European Convention at a domestic level. But the Gender Recognition Act is no longer necessary in terms of same-sex marriage, in terms of pension equality. And I'm sympathetic to the view that we should be looking at this. We don't necessarily need primary legislation when we're looking at this. We should be looking at trans healthcare. We should be looking at birth certificates that, or identity affirmation that allow people to marry or be buried in line with the gender identity that they hold. But when looking at that, I think that's got to be separate to looking at the Equality Act. And I think that the government and the lawmakers and also the judges have really avoided this question. And that's what's created this huge toxic and polarised discussion amongst campaigners, amongst activists, amongst academics, because of the gap that's been left by the failure to take this on and address it head on.
I would just like to add as well that I think although I heard Professor Sharp talking about two streams, and it may be that when you drill down into the legal relationship between the two, according to some academic view of them, they don't relate. But I think in the ordinary person's world, they seem to relate because you have a person who has a birth certificate potentially that they could produce, and they certainly now say, I am legally a woman or I am legally a man. The GRA concentrates an awful lot on privacy, and it goes out of its way to specify some circumstances in which acquired gender may not be the presumptive most important thing. For instance, hereditary peerages, sport, and some sexual offences. But it doesn't mention spaces, and so it's normal that people will assume that if somebody has a GRC, that they will be entitled to access all the spaces, resources, and groups that someone of the opposite sex would. And this is not a situation that has been helped by the government following the last trans inquiry in saying that the very highest bar would have to be set before the same-sex, single-sex exemptions could be operated. So that came from the government. There's a persistent kind of impression given by even the EHRC, who is also a Stonewall diversity champion, that you have to. It's really highly unusual that you should be allowed as an organisation to invoke these exemptions. Whereas in my view, it should be absolutely commonplace, because there are so many situations where sex is going to make a difference, particularly where women are undressing or sleeping or in prison or in a hostel or in a refuge. So I think that there's absolutely a need for clarity here on what the relationship is.
I thought there was a really interesting potential contradiction between what Alex Sharp said when she said that there'd be no change because the sex-based exemptions would still exist, and then one of the other panellists, I think it was Stephen Whittle, said it was important to replace the language of sex with gender identity. Now, these are two distinct things, and it makes a huge difference. Let me give you a concrete example. So tomorrow the Scottish Parliament will be voting on whether the law in Scotland should allow rape victims to specify the sex of the person who conducts a forensic examination, or the gender, which the Scottish Government have admitted are not the same thing. So there's a fundamental rights conflict there between the right of women to say that they only want that intimate examination in that particularly painful circumstances to be a female, and the desire of someone who may have been born male to be considered as a woman in that context. Now, whatever you think the answer to that rights conflict is, we've got to actually acknowledge there's a rights conflict and have a grown-up conversation about it.
I think it's very difficult. We're talking often about very underfunded organisations, particularly if we're talking about women's refuges. This is a very underfunded sector. And if an organisation, a lobby group, campaigners come to you and say, we will offer you free legal advice and help you to be compliant with the Equality Act or with any other piece of legislation, or come to you and say, you are not going to be compliant and we're going to try and take you to court, you can understand why these cash-strapped and resource-strapped refuges might have had policy capture by those organisations. There are very few who are clear that they are applying the Equality Act and the single-sex exemptions in line with the law. There are many who are terrified to speak out, and so even though they know what the Equality Act and single-sex exemptions are, they are worried that they won't get funding in, whether it's government funding, whether it's from private donors, whether it's from trusts and charitable trusts. And part of that is because if they have accusations levelled at them that they're transphobic, given that there's so little funding in the sector, funders are more likely to give to someone else. So I think it's very difficult to get a map of whether an organisation does know the law or whether it actually feels comfortable saying that it knows the law, because they're two key different issues.
I would just like to add that I think we don't yet have a true picture of service users' experiences, and that we really need one. So we're often told via kind of trans activist organisations that there's no problem here, and in fact I believe it was a submission to the last trans inquiry from I think it was James Morton, who said something like we should just educate service users into feeling more comfortable with a trans person and in a rape crisis centre or a domestic violence refuge. But rather than take that paternalistic sort of line, I think we should find out whether this is making a difference to women. Is it in fact stopping them from self-referring to rape crisis centres? Or we could also take this conversation into the healthcare realm. Are they avoiding going for breast examinations? So I think we need some proper non-politicised data from academics about what service users feel in relation to this, particularly when they've been traumatised. If you're a rape victim, quite often you can be re-traumatised through inadvertent exposure to certain sights and sounds and smells. It's not a matter of it's not a rational process, traumatisation, and PTSD doesn't just respond to being told that you should educate yourself. So I think we really need to put those people front and centre, their experience and what is best for them, and listen to their experiences, get some sense of what they are. Here I have a difference with the previous witnesses in that I'm afraid I don't think it's a human right to have your identity recognised by the state on its own. I think you have rights to be protected against discrimination and harassment for being trans, and I think that gender reassignment should continue to be a protected characteristic in the Equality Act. But I don't see that there's anything infringing your rights by... I think, put it this way, I think that the idea that self-identification is a human right is based on the idea of gender identity being a permanent and innate thing, whereas by the witness's own evidence in the last session it isn't. It's often fluid, temporary, and certainly there's no evidence to suggest it's innate. It's produced by context, environmental context. So I don't think that there's a particular right there. I think we need to really protect the rights of trans people in relation to discrimination and violence and harassment, and also think about women.
What the previous panellists were referring to, they call it the right to self-determine. There is no human right to self-determine. There is a right of peoples to self-determine, which is enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and was aimed at colonialism. It was a right of peoples to choose who would govern over them and to have permanency over their natural resources. Now, I don't have an individual right to choose who governs over me, and nor do you. We have the right as a people, right? It's a collective right. The change in this language maybe just because people misunderstood it, or it might be disingenuous, but there is no human right to self-determine. There is only a right of peoples to self-determine.
I just wanted to flag that there is a diversity of trans voices on this, and the Gender Identity Lobby doesn't represent all trans people and doesn't represent, for example, a lot of detransition voices. So I just hope that you'll hear from some of those voices.
If we think about the single-sex exemptions, that's recognising that there might be a conflict of rights. And I think we also need to think about religious groups. There are religious groups, and religion is a protected characteristic. Religious groups who do have sex-segregated spaces because it's proportionate or legitimate to do so, or may even have sex-based roles, whether it's in terms of spiritual leaders or roles within a church or a synagogue or a mosque. I was also particularly thinking about the rights of females and males who won't get changed in front of people of the opposite sex. I was thinking in particular around Hampstead Ponds and the fact that the ladies' pond has typically been used by religious groups who won't swim in mixed-sex spaces, but self-ID would turn those spaces into mixed-sex spaces because it would have allowed people to identify their gender and then come into those spaces.
I think the important thing that really needs to be got across in discussing is that this is about male patterns. If we're talking about the worry about violence and sexual assault, right? Women are much more likely than men to be sexually assaulted, and where they are sexually assaulted, in 90% plus of cases, it is males that do so. And we're not just talking about rape, we're talking about other kinds of sexual assault, voyeurism, flashing, upskirting, taking revenge porn. You know, there's a range of things here that can happen where women undress and speak and sleep in public spaces. And the worry, you know, up until now, it has been uncontroversial that we exclude all males, including all the innocent ones, and the majority of, you know, reasonable people, on the basis that we want to also exclude a few malfeasant people. And that has been perfectly well understood. That it was never a character reference. It was never supposed to say that all males were bad, because they clearly aren't. Exactly the same logic applies with self-ID and the thought about spaces. Exactly. But so in other words, it's excluding the many innocents in order to focus on a few. But there's no reason to think that once you self-ID as a woman, you become, you know, less subject to the statistical generalizations that apply to the male sex. Having said that, I would just add that in the last trans inquiry, you should look again at the evidence submitted by the British Association of Gender Specialists, I can check that and send you it, and by the British Psychological Society, who are, you know, very trans-friendly organisations, but say, of course there are circumstances where people will identify in order for malfeasant purposes. Of course there are. It's human nature. So we're not saying, of course that's not all trans people, but equally it's very strange to rule that out a priori. It's completely strange.
I just wanted very briefly to say that the reason that women value single-sex spaces isn't only about the fear of being assaulted. I mean, I want a single-sex changing room, mainly for privacy and dignity, and not because I think a mixed changing room would necessarily lead to a fear of violence. Similarly, when a woman asks for a female to do a cervical smear test, it's not that she thinks a male doctor would attack her. It's about the dignity of that woman, and I think we accept that women have a right to ask for those things.
I think it's really important that we recognise that many trans individuals are vulnerable, right? Because we are all under patriarchal structures, and it is patriarchal structures make women vulnerable, make trans individuals vulnerable, make homosexuals vulnerable, and so on. But what I heard in the last panel was Professor Sharp completely dismissing out of hand women's fears and women's concerns around violence, and dismissing out of hand the cases where, and they are cases from many countries, not just from the UK, where men have used the self-ID regimes of those countries in order to access women's spaces, particularly prisons, in order to rape them. One rape is too many, and I don't think we should ever dismiss out of hand those concerns. That's not to say that all men, as Kathleen said, are predatory, and certainly not all trans individuals are. But we have to have laws in place that protect the most vulnerable, and we have to recognise women's vulnerability. The starting point is to go to the initial consultation that led to the self-ID proposal from the government. And if you look down it, the main concern is around healthcare. And if I'm taking a human rights lens, trans individuals are not having their healthcare needs met by this country. There's simply not enough, and you heard it from the last panel, from start to finish. Even someone like Professor Whittle, who has a GRC, is not having his healthcare needs met by the current system. We need more money and more funding into it, and I would say currently that we are violating the right to health of trans individuals in this country. I think that the self-ID regime only works if we have proper definitions, and only works if we have proper legislation. But I think that there are other ways of doing this. We don't need primary legislation. We could have identity affirmation or birth certificates that allow people to marry, to be buried, to do the things that affect them individually. We should make these much more easily accessible. I think it was very clear from the previous panel that the lack of transparency of the gender recognition panel needs to be addressed, and all of those issue areas. What we need to work out is how that identity affirmation or birth certificates then works where it affects others. We need better service provision for trans individuals, for those that want to have mixed gender identity service, but also we need to find ways to protect sex segregation, and we can only do that with a grown-up conversation. And for 3 years I've watched many of these academics and activists refuse to engage in that conversation, refuse to discuss with us, refuse to sit on panels with those with opposite views. So how are we going to come up with the way of resolving conflicts of rights if we can't even talk? It's pretty clear that the government thought that self-ID would be the same easy win that same-sex marriage was, right? And same-sex marriage was an easy win because love is love and anyone should marry whoever they want to, so long as that person consents. What the government hadn't foreseen was the vast numbers of concerns from different groups, women's groups, religious groups, all sorts of groups, sports groups, data statisticians, around self-ID. I don't think that they had thought it through properly. Now, the statistics of how many people responded to that consultation, when you think it had about 20 odd questions with free text boxes, and I don't envy the person that had to sit down and go through that data, but many of the respondents were simply given the forms, filled out, and told how to fill this out, which skews the data. We saw it with the National Union of Students, we saw it with other activist and campaign groups, telling their constituents how to fill it out and giving them a pre-filled out, essentially, here's a copy and paste. So whoever has to analyse that data at some point, if anyone does, will also have to work out how many of those responses were genuine responses from individuals writing their thoughts out, and how many were using this system, gaming the system, to flood it in the hope that that would skew the data.
I agree with Rosa that the government did not understand what it was doing, mainly because it had been only listening to a very narrow section of opinion, which was telling them that it was all fine and this is what everybody wanted and there'd be no consequences for anybody else. And then through the dogged persistence of grassroots feminist groups like Women's Place, Fair Play for Women, Transgender Trend, the LGB Alliance, these issues were forced into the light with no particularly great funding either. So I think it's a real testament to them. But it was basically the exposure of a kind of narrow ideological position into the light, and the government cannot ignore the very obvious concerns that there are around allowing people to self-ID from one sex to the next.
We live in a democracy, and the government was probably mindful of public opinion, which is quite appropriate. So recent YouGov polling shows, for example, people are very supportive of trans people and their right to live as they wish, but only 16% of people think that changing legal gender should be possible without a doctor's approval. And people's responses to questions about trans people and what services they should access and so on, that change quite a bit once it's explained to them that a trans woman, for example, might have had no genital surgery, no medical intervention. Once that's explained, then most people don't think that trans women should be allowed into women's sports and women's changing rooms. So I think there's a question about the definition of terms and actually getting everybody to be having a conversation where we know what we're talking about, because I think people have huge sympathy with the very small number of fully transitioned transsexuals that the original GRA legislation would have been about, and absolutely respect everybody's right to live their lives as they wish, but don't necessarily see why there should be a legal status for a personal identity which doesn't change your body, given that that conflicts with women's right to privacy.
I think for many years, the trans lobby groups and trans activists have captured the ears, whether it was of policymakers, whether it was of smaller institutions, and also of parts of the media. I think women's groups, particularly as Kathleen said, Women's Place UK, which sprang up in order to help women to organise at the grassroots level and to be able to voice their concerns, found it very difficult to be able to talk to these policymakers. And it's only through their sheer hard work and determination and the fact that these are left-wing trade union women who know how to organise that they even were able to speak to the government. I do take on board what some trans individuals and some trans allies say, which are parts of the media will only listen to women's concerns and parts of the media will only listen to trans concerns. And I think that there needs to be far better coverage, certainly by the BBC, far better coverage of both sides. And currently the BBC is very much captured by the sort of trans voices. That's not to say that there are, the Murdoch press has ever given any time to trans voices. And I think we need to be open and honest and upfront about this, that the media plays a strong role in how they're portraying this type of capture. But if you look at the amount of organisations that have gone in to speak to the government, it's by far skewed towards the trans organisations or organisations supporting trans rather than the women's grassroots organisations.
If you look back to 2015, that Stonewall published A Vision for Change, this document that then was pretty much set out its agenda, including self-ID and various other things that have been on the agenda of the government up until recently. So it may seem to some people as if the government is listening disproportionately to women's voices, but it really is the first time in recent years since that they've been heard at all. So I think there's maybe been an overcorrection in some areas, but as Rosa says, in other areas, we still can't get through. We can't get a fair hearing in places where we would naturally feel at home, like The Guardian or the BBC. So, I think it's patchy and you can't tell, Rosa's point is well taken, you can't tell a single story, but I don't recognise the phenomenon that you've described, no.
I really want to thank this committee for listening to women's voices, because I think this is something that hasn't happened up till now. And in fact, those lobbying for self-ID have had far more access to GEO ministers than organisations lobbying for women's rights. So records requested via Freedom of Information show that Liz Truss had 3 meetings with pro-self-ID organisations and individuals between taking up her role and announcing her decision on GRA reform, whereas she did not meet with any of those urging caution, including women's organisations such as WP UK and Fair Play for Women. Coming at this from a data collection point of view, I would have really liked to have seen clear guidance on data collection and equalities monitoring. This is one of the areas where I think there's been muddle because people are confused between sex and gender identity, and we need to make a clear distinction between the two and say they're both important and we need data on both. So I would have liked to see the government recognise the legitimacy and importance of collecting and analysing data based on sex. And in particular, I would have liked them to say that publicly funded or mandated data, such as the census or equal pay monitoring, should always include a natal sex variable. And of course, we can also collect data on gender identity alongside that.
I would like some explicit consideration of spouses, and I hope that this committee will hear from the spouses or ex-spouses of transition people from a range of perspectives. But I think in the emphasis of the committee, of the government rather, on kindness, that's fine, and good, but kindness obviously needs to be applied across the board and not just towards one group. And I think that we don't hear enough from spouses, and it would be good to keep them in focus as well.
Picking up on Kathleen's point, we have to recognise marriage as a contract, and if someone unilaterally changes the terms of that contract, the contract would normally be void. And I think it's really important that we hear spousal voices. I think that the key thing for me is around gender dysphoria. I take on board the point that the World Health Organization has said that transgenderism should not be medicalized anymore, seen as a medical condition. But if people don't have gender dysphoria, then I think that we need some very explicit guidance on the basis at which they access free NHS healthcare if it's not a medical condition. And this really needs to be worked out, because it's all well and good to say we don't want to call it a medical condition, but then how does that impact trans healthcare, which is a key issue that I keep coming back to. I think actually that 2-year gap, the lead up to the consultation, and the consultation itself opened out these discussions within the general public. And as Alice says, this is a democratic society, and those discussions had to be had. Within that 2-year gap, and I accept that gap is partly to do with Brexit and partly to do with the sheer volume of submissions that were received. But within that time, this opened out more and more discussions for more and more people, including women's groups, but certainly not just limited to women's groups. I think that there has been a particular toxicity in online spaces. And I think that has not been helped by the leadership from academics who are either trans themselves or are allies of trans individuals and advancing trans sort of activist positions, to refuse to have grown-up conversations with their counterparts. For me, I was on Women's Hour being interviewed alongside Alex Sharp. Alex Sharp is a professor of law and a barrister. Part of our jobs as lawyers is to discuss and debate and argue things in courtrooms or elsewhere. And I was very disappointed that Professor Sharp refused to have a conversation with me and wanted to be interviewed separately. But I think that feeds into the toxicity of the debate and the demonization of those people who are trying to express different opinions based on robust evidence.
We heard a lot in the last session about Ireland, but I think it's also notable, and what's come to light in the course of our public discussion in the UK is that there's evidence that trans activist organisations have deliberately tried to keep the discussion of gender recognition reform under the radar, talking directly to politicians, but keeping it out of the public eye. And that came out in a document that was published, I'm thinking of an article in The Spectator by James Kirkup, but it talks about this document published by, I think it was Denton's legal organisation, advising trans activist organisations about how best to get what they want. So I think that's profoundly anti-democratic, and there isn't a massively stunning history of women's rights in Ireland. So when we're confronted now with this, Ireland as the place where everything's fine, I would really like to know, A, how many of ordinary citizens in Ireland knew what was happening when the law was changed, and B, what effect has all that had on ordinary women, if indeed their daily lives have changed in relation to exposure to trans people in changing rooms and so on. So I think we need more information there too, and we can't just assume because we've been told by trans activist organisations everything's fine in these other countries that it is.
To add to that, we are always told about the example of Malta. Malta, abortion is illegal. It's criminalised in Malta. Many of the countries that are cited around, look at these great self-ID regimes, first of all, the citation doesn't drill down into the detail about retaining sex-based exemptions, but as Kathleen says, certainly doesn't drill down into the detail around very shocking and very recent histories on women's rights.
I fully endorse what's been said about the 2-year gap actually being important in opening up debate and discussion. I think it's true that there has been toxicity, but we've got to think about why that is. It's actually been driven by gender identity activists concertedly trying to shut people who disagree with them up. If I can give you one example, in the recent Labour Party leadership and deputy leadership elections, several candidates actually pledged to expel advocates from women's rights from the party. Now, I attended a solidarity rally to defend A Woman's Place UK and LGB Alliance in the wake of that in March this year, and the meeting was held near Grenfell Tower. Gender identity extremists actually attempted to intimidate women and frighten women attending that meeting by letting off smoke bombs to give the impression of a fire. And bearing in mind the location, that was horrifying. And I can testify to how frightening and intimidating the behaviour of those activists was. In contrast, I am not aware of a single attempt to stop gender identity activists from meeting or to disrupt their events or activities. So there is toxicity, but it's very much driven in one direction by an attempt to shut down a normal conversation. We live in a democracy, and debate and consultation are not harmful. So we hear a lot of hyperbolic language about this, calling debate literal violence and so on. Well, conversation is really important in a democracy. We need conversation. It's not harmful. I think in terms of what the government could do, I think we need politicians across the political spectrum to actually stand up for women's civil liberties. So, for example, when a woman MP like Rosie Duffield is monstered simply for suggesting we should be able to use the word woman rather than cervix haver, I think most people would find that absurd. There's still time for parliamentarians, I think, to speak out and to try to help create a more normal environment in which women would feel less at risk speaking up.
For many years, trans groups, LGBT, homosexual groups and women's groups have found intersections in terms of fighting against patriarchal structures. But there are times when those groups have their own interests, and there are other times when those interests might conflict. And I think that's really important to flag here. For me, the government allowing Stonewall to monopolise these discussions without recognising that there are people, constituents of Stonewall, who oppose Stonewall's current position in terms of sex and gender identity. And the government allowing that monopoly to go ahead, not just within government structures, but within academic institutions, schools, the NHS, and so on, has been key to driving this toxic, harmful kind of divisions between these interest groups. And I think it's absolutely crucial that the government opens up space for other grassroots activist organisations to come in and advise them, to come in and be consulted with, and also to have access to funding.
I couldn't agree more with that. It just absolutely has to be recognised that Stonewall and gendered intelligence do not speak for all trans people. And I get emails all the time from transsexuals and trans people who say this is nothing to do with me. I do not recognise this conception of rights or gender identity or what we want in relation to women's spaces. I feel now that this whole toxicity is now putting me newly at risk in a way that I wasn't before. So there's just this kind of assumption that Stonewall must have their ear straight mainlined in to somehow the hive mind of trans people. And of course, trans people aren't a hive mind. They have a range of political views. They have a range of all sorts of different things. So a better consultation that starts from a neutral standpoint, that doesn't come in with a sort of heavily rhetorical kind of manipulative language, but just really does seek to fact find from a range of voices about what's going on without taking any one person as standing for a group. So of course we're not speaking for all women. I would never pretend to speak for all women. And I can't tell you about the women's community or the gay women's community, as I am a gay woman, because there's a range of voices there and you need to hear from all of them. That's what the democratic process requires.
We have to listen to trans voices as to how the gender recognition process would work better for them. And I listened to the voices on the panel earlier, but I've listened to voices over the last 3 years, and it needs to be cheaper. It needs to be more accessible. It needs to have more transparency, and it needs to work. I think that it's not just about gaining a gender recognition certificate. It's distressing to hear about Professor Whittle struggling to access a healthcare that a natal-born man would access easily. And it's disturbing to hear about people having to go through such undignified processes in order to be able to avoid the embarrassment of their wedding day, being married in the sex that they don't present as. In terms of how that legislation then works for women's rights, that I can talk to. Most of the countries where there is some form of identity affirmation or self-declaration also have robust laws in place around sex-based exemptions. We've got the laws in the Equality Act. We need to define those laws, and we need to define the circumstances in which those laws do or don't apply for those with or without a gender recognition certificate. There is no avoiding this. We need to define what gender identity is. We need to define it legally and from a policy point of view, and we need to explain how the law works for different sets of situations. They need to be written down and agreed upon and enshrined, and then organisations will be able to apply them. That is what happens in some of the other countries to which panellists have referenced. It's really important, though, to note that countries like Denmark have had similar problems to Ireland in terms of self-ID, in terms of the predatory males, not the general trans population, but the predatory males using those systems in order to access women's spaces, and particularly rapes in prisons. But I think that there is no way for the government and the judiciary and the lawmakers to avoid the fact that the ball is in your court to actually define how the law works before putting in an identity affirmation regime.
I would just add to that, to the first part, that I'm told that 41% of applicants for gender recognition certificates are now under the age of 29, and that's a big change. So I think it's very important that they get the right healthcare, including, and I think we should also consider this, you should consider this, in light of the fact that CAMS, Children and Adolescent Mental Health Services, is chronically underfunded. So there needs to be full mental health provision for younger people contemplating a life-changing change. And it is a life-changing change for many of them, because for many of them it will involve taking medication or having surgery that they might later come to regret. So I think there should be full attention on the healthcare of trans people. That seems perfectly reasonable. And the other thing I don't, with respect to single-sex spaces, what I really never have understood is why trans activist organisations couldn't go for third spaces. Why couldn't they put their considerable power behind the case for, third spaces in addition to single-sex spaces? And so that would be something that I think should be properly explored, rather than this constant either or. We've either got trans women in men's spaces or we've got them in women's spaces. Well, look, there are other ways to do this. Gender is one of the most ambiguous words I can possibly think of. Sometimes it's just used as a polite euphemism for biological sex, as when traditionally a passport application would ask you what your gender was, male or female. Sometimes it's used to cover masculinity and femininity, so the social meanings or stereotypes around biological sex. Sometimes by some academics, it's used to mean something like womanhood or manhood that's assumed to be different from being male or female, but that's not a widely understood meaning. And then now we have gender identity, which is a purely psychological identification with an ideal of the opposite sex or with androgyny. And then in the Gender Recognition Act, we've got acquired gender, where it's really not clear to me what an acquired gender is, whether it's an acquired sex but I think the best way to understand it is a kind of fiction that somebody has changed sex, because in my considered view, it is impossible to actually change sex, so it could only be an acquired, it could only be a fiction. So it's multiply ambiguous, and sometimes you find people arguing about things. You think, well, if you could only explain your terms or define your terms, you'd find you agreed with each other, but you're arguing actually about two different things.
I think we need legal definitions for gender identity, transgender, gender reassignment, right? That might involve having a legal definition for gender, but I want to make it clear, no one has these legal definitions. Even at the UN level, the legal definition just involves the same umbrella of various different groups, and we heard from the last panel, and when we listen to trans voices, those groups are very different to one another. Trans women and trans men have very different sort of needs and interests, as do non-binary individuals and gender fluid and everyone else that comes within this Stonewall definition that's been adopted at the UN level and at other levels. If we look at other countries, we often get circular definitions. So your gender identity is the gender that you identify as. That doesn't help us. And we need these definitions, and we need to consult with trans groups to understand what these legal definitions are and how they will be most useful for trans groups. But we also need to consult with women's groups around how those definitions work in terms of the definition that we have in law currently for sex, which does date back to, 1970 or so. But the definition that we have in law is around biology. And if that definition is to be changed, it should be changed through legal and democratic processes, not through kind of stealth, trying to replace the word sex with gender or gender identity in lots of policies.
Of course, if you're making legislation, you need to define your terms. And I'll just give you a quick example of the confusion that can arise. So the Gender Recognition Act talks about acquired gender, but in the notes that I was looking at yesterday, it says that if you've got a GRC, you will be protected under the protected characteristic of sex. The Equality Act talks about gender reassignment, but it also talks about changing sex. So there's huge confusion around this area already, and I think they need to be redrafted to make it clearer.
There are statistics from a Swedish study, which I can send to you after the session, if that's helpful. They were written up in academic journals and things like that. So they're robust data, as Alice would say. I try to avoid being too academic when I'm in these kind of sessions, but it's a well-known Swedish study on offending rates and male-born people, whether they are men or trans women.
I'm aware of that study too, and it's certainly good evidence, but it only refers to people who have had, as I recall, medical and hormonal intervention. So what we lack is evidence about self-ID. No one's ever looked for that evidence as far as I can see, but I certainly don't accept that we should somehow, the lack of that evidence should mean that we go ahead with this, because we have to be cautious. There's going to be, if we're right, there's going to be a big impact on women's lives. So I think academics need to go and look for that evidence. And at the moment, we're not in a situation where that kind of investigation can happen neutrally because of the politicization of the academic sphere. But it would be a very good idea if we could have access to that evidence. But we shouldn't assume because we don't have it that then everything must be fine. That would be crazy.
It's the opposite way round to how we would normally act. Normally, if you want to make changes, you have to provide the evidence to show that those changes are safe or why those changes are needed, that you have to provide the data, the robust evidence, and so on. This almost seems a little bit Kafkaesque, that women are being asked to provide the data, and there are studies out there, but to show why things must stay the same. We have a long history in society of why we have sex-segregated spaces, whether that's women's access to political participation, women's access to public life, women's access to swimming. That's why Hampstead Ladies Pond was built, because it was, women weren't allowed to swim in mixed-sex spaces or in the seaside. Women's access to sports, all of these, there's a long history for it, and there is all sorts of evidence as to why we need sex-segregated spaces. If there is to be gender identity segregated spaces, then those who are advocating for it need to bring the robust data to show why it won't impact on women. Most trans individuals are not predatory, but there will be predatory males. We have the data, we have the rapes in prisons, not just in this country, but in Ireland, in Denmark and elsewhere. We know that there are predatory males.
I wouldn't talk about the trans lobby, I would talk about the gender identity lobby, because I think trans people have a range of views. I think what the Freedom of Information request shows very clearly is that gender identity groups like Stonewall have very good access to government. So they have been listened to. Obviously, that does not imply that they got what they wanted, because being listened to and getting what you want are two different things. So no, I think they probably were disappointed by the result. So they have an advantage in terms of access to government, but despite that, I don't think they got what they wanted on this occasion. However, I think with GRA reform, something quite interesting that's happened is that organisations have acted in advance of what they thought the legal change was going to be. And so there's a lot that's changed ahead of the law. So if we look at data collection, for example, we're losing data collection on sex because organisations think they have to collect data based on self-ID. So police forces are recording crimes by men as though they were committed by women at the request of the perpetrator. ACAS organisational pay gap data being collected according to gender identity rather than sex, with the option to exclude non-binary employees from the data entirely. The replacement of actual sex with desired sex on medical records at patient request, which is harmful for research, but often also harmful for those individual trans patients in terms of their care. And government has actually issued guidance to government departments saying they must not use sex as a data category unless they genuinely cannot provide the service in question without this information. So what you've got is an ideology that says we can't talk about sex and we can't collect data on sex. And that's running through not just government, but a range of organisations. And that's what we've got to sort out.
Well, I'll go down the law route because that's my expertise, and I think you'd rather have my expertise than my personal opinion. In law, it says that a man is someone who's born male with biology in terms of chromosomes, gonads, and genitalia, and a woman is someone who's born female with the same biological factors. Now, there is the legal fiction where a trans woman or a trans man may gain a gender recognition certificate that changes their legal sex, but doesn't change their actual sex. So currently in law, a trans woman is a trans woman unless she holds a GRC, in which case she is male, she is a trans woman, but legally she would be recognised as a woman for many, but not all purposes. Now, if that sounds complicated, it's because the law is currently in a bit of a mess, and that's why we need to change it and try and streamline this. But my opinion, therefore, changes depending on whether someone holds a GRC or not, but I stick in line with what the law currently says, that your sex is determined by biology.
I think that we have two sexes, males and females. We have the human versions, the human males and females, and we have the adult and the younger versions, adult human males and females and younger. And we need a category to describe what the adult human male and the adult human female is, because it aids communication about a vast range of things, given that we are a sexually dimorphic species that reproduces via heterosexuality. So in other words, I think woman is adult human female and man is adult human male. That's the best understanding of those categories.
So I think I've been very clear. I think there's a distinction between sex and gender identity. Both of them are quite properly protected characteristics, and we need to see them as distinct. I think the slogan, trans women are women, has been actually really unhelpful. Grown-up, mature adults do not talk in slogans. We need to think about the fact that there might be contexts where we want to treat trans women as though they were women and trans men as though they were men, and other contexts where that's not appropriate. For example, if we think about sporting categories or changing rooms or data collection, all sorts of different issues may come up, and we need to have a sensible conversation about those different contexts.
You argue that data providers should be encouraged to collect data on respondents' sex as a distinct from gender identity. Is it possible for that to be done in a way which doesn't undermine both the GRA and those who have obtained a gender recognition certificate?
Earlier this year, the ONS raised this with me as a possible objection to asking for sex in the census. I would say that, when we collect data, privacy considerations are also always paramount. It's always anonymised. It's not about outing people. So I was very pleased that a recent legal opinion that's just come out in the last couple of days challenges what I was told by ONS. So apparently the EHRC has misrepresented the law according to a legal opinion by Aidan O'Neill QC, and if I may quote from that, he concluded that a mandatory question relative to what was your sex at birth will not constitute an unlawful intrusion into an individual's right to respect for their private life if the information is required by a public authority or a private body exercising public law functions in accordance with law, and the information is properly necessary for the achievement of a legitimate aim. So in response to that, A Woman's Place have challenged EHRC to change their guidance in line with that.
I think there's one issue that hasn't arisen on either panel, and I think relates to privacy, which is I find it deeply concerning, and I hear some trans voices who've helped me to understand how deeply concerning it is that we have lists of trans people through the Gender Recognition Act and those who have a gender recognition certificate. The idea of governments having lists of vulnerable groups doesn't sit particularly well with me in terms of my personal and religious Jewish history, and I think it doesn't sit very well with many individuals who are trans, for whom they have had to live in shadow throughout their lives. I think that's something that ought to be raised, where those lists actually do violate the right to private and family life and rights to privacy. I don't have an answer, but I do think it's an important question and concern that I've heard from the trans community, or parts of the trans community, and I think needs to be addressed by the government.
Can I just say thank you to all of the panellists for your contributions in this afternoon's discussion. I hope that you feel that your views have been heard in this forum. We hope that we will all be able to improve transgender equality whilst also hearing the voices of the many different people involved. Can I just say thank you to each of the panellists, and that will bring the session to a close.